The smell of bay rum and lather hung thick in the air of the basement barber shop on Borough High Street, mixing with something else, something bitter that might have been medicine or might have been poison, a scent that the customers who sat in George Chapman's chair never quite identified before they rose to leave, their faces smooth and their necks newly shaved, their trust in the quiet foreign barber absolute and unquestioned. It was 1897, London. The Whitechapel district and its surroundings still whispered about Jack the Ripper, about the autumn of terror 9 years earlier, when 5 women had been butchered in ways that suggested anatomical knowledge, surgical skill, the kind of precision that came from training with scalpels and from understanding how bodies opened, where blood flowed, how organs could be extracted with cuts that were deliberate rather than frenzied. George Chapman, though that was not the name he had been born with, was not the name he had carried when he arrived in England from Poland in 1887, moved through his shop with the efficiency of a man who knew his trade, who had studied medicine in his youth, who had trained as a Feldsher, a kind of barber-surgeon in Poland and Russia, who understood anatomy in ways that his customers never suspected. His hands were steady as they held the razor, as they tilted heads back and exposed throats, as they scraped steel across vulnerable flesh while the men in his chair sat with eyes closed, trusting completely, never imagining that the man who held the blade had perhaps held other blades in other circumstances, had perhaps opened throats that did not heal, had perhaps possessed knowledge and opportunity and something dark inside him that made killing not an aberration, but a possibility that existed always just beneath the surface of ordinary life. But Chapman did not kill with razors, did not spill blood across his shop floor, did not create the kind of spectacular violence that Jack the Ripper had created. His method was quieter, was slower, was more domestic and therefore more insidious, because it happened in homes rather than in alleyways, happened to women who trusted him completely, who shared his bed and his business and his life, who died over weeks and months rather than in minutes, who suffered in ways that no one recognized as murder until it was too late, until 3 women were dead and buried, and a 4th had survived only because a doctor had finally recognized that the symptoms were not natural disease but were the effects of antimony poisoning, deliberate and sustained and administered by someone who had both access and motive. The basement shop was quiet now, the last customer gone, the sun setting over London's rooftops, the gas lamps beginning to glow in the streets above. Chapman cleaned his razors with care, stropped them to maintain the edge, arranged them in the case where they would wait until tomorrow's customers arrived. Upstairs in the living quarters above the shop, his wife, his 3rd wife, though the law did not recognize the marriages, because he had never divorced his first wife, had simply moved from woman to woman as circumstances required, was feeling unwell, was suffering from stomach pains and vomiting that had been growing worse over recent weeks, that the doctor had attributed to some digestive ailment, but that would eventually be recognized as the early stages of antimony poisoning, the same condition that had killed the 2 women before her. The pattern was established, though no one yet saw it. Chapman would take a woman as his partner, would live with her, would work alongside her in whatever business venture they operated together, and then after months or years the woman would begin to sicken, would complain of stomach pains and nausea, would grow weaker despite medical attention, would eventually die after weeks or months of suffering, while doctors diagnosed natural illness, and while Chapman played the role of devoted husband, nursing his dying wife. After the death he would mourn briefly and then would find another woman, would begin the cycle again, would repeat the pattern that would eventually claim 3 lives before anyone recognized that these deaths were connected, were not coincidences, but were murders committed slowly and carefully by a man who understood that poison was harder to detect than violence, that domestic deaths attracted less scrutiny than street murders, that patient killers could operate for years before patterns became visible. The razor gleamed in the lamplight as Chapman set it aside, its edge sharp enough to split hair or skin, its purpose purely innocent in the context of his legitimate work but symbolic of the dual nature of his existence, the surface respectability that concealed something darker, the professional competence that masked homicidal intention. Upstairs his wife cried out softly as another wave of pain struck her stomach, and Chapman listened without expression, calculating perhaps how long it would take, how much more antimony would be needed, when he might safely begin looking for the next woman who would trust him enough to die for him. The barber shop in Borough High Street would continue operating for months more, would serve customers who never suspected that the quiet foreign barber, who shaved them so skillfully, had also poisoned 3 women to death, who never connected the gentle hands that held the razor to the hands that had measured out antimony tartrate and had stirred it into tea and food and medicine, who never imagined that the man who smiled and nodded and took their coins was a serial killer whose crimes would eventually make him one of the most notorious poisoners in British legal history, and whose possible connection to Jack the Ripper would be debated for more than a century after his execution. But that revelation lay ahead, lay in the future when suspicion would finally become investigation, when exhumations would reveal poison in bodies that had been buried as natural deaths, when the pattern would become undeniable, and when George Chapman would face trial for murder and would hang for crimes that were proved and for crimes that were suspected but never confirmed, for the women he had killed and perhaps for the women in Whitechapel who had died 9 years earlier under a different killer's knife. The night deepened over London. The barbershop fell silent, and upstairs a woman suffered while her husband waited and watched and calculated, a patient killer pursuing his work with the same steady competence he brought to shaving customers, with the same anatomical knowledge, with the same cold precision that characterized everything he did, whether with razor or with poison, whether in the sudden violence of the Ripper or in the slow death of the poisoner, whether as the monster of Whitechapel or as the quiet murderer of Borough High Street whose crimes were only beginning to be understood. Chapter 1. The Foreign Barber. Foreign Barber arrives. Good evening and welcome back to the Bedside Historian. The night has found you wherever you are, and I hope you are settled comfortably, in a place of quiet and safety, in darkness that feels peaceful rather than threatening. Tonight we journey to Victorian London, to the East End in the late 1880s, to Whitechapel and its surrounding districts where poverty and desperation created conditions that bred violence, where immigrants arrived seeking better lives and sometimes found only exploitation and death, where a man named Severin Klosowski would arrive from Poland and would transform himself into George Chapman, would establish himself as a respectable barber, and would live a double existence that would eventually claim at least 3 lives and that would raise questions about whether he might have claimed 5 others under a different name, with a different method, in murders that would become the most infamous unsolved crimes in British history. Before we descend into this story of poison and speculation, of proven murders and suspected connections, I invite you to subscribe to this channel if you have not already done so. These narratives require extensive research, careful examination of trial records and contemporary accounts, hours spent reconstructing lives and crimes from fragmentary evidence. Your support allows this work to continue, allows these dark chapters of history to be told with the care and accuracy they deserve. Now then, where are you listening from tonight? What hour finds you? Is it late evening where you are, the day's obligations finished, and the night stretching ahead? Or perhaps it is the deep hours past midnight when sleep eludes you and history provides companionship in the darkness. Wherever you are, whatever brings you to this story, settle in, let the modern world recede, and let us travel together to London in 1887, to a city that was the heart of the largest empire the world had ever known, that was also a place of profound inequality and suffering, where wealth and poverty existed side by side, where the lives of the poor were brief and brutal, and where a young Polish immigrant would arrive carrying skills and knowledge that would serve him well in legitimate work and that would also enable him to kill with a patience and a precision that would characterize all his subsequent crimes. Severin Antonovich Klosowski was born in December 1865 in the village of Nagornak in Congress, Poland, the portion of Poland that was then part of the Russian Empire, a region characterized by poverty and limited opportunity, where young men of ability sought advancement through education or through emigration, where staying meant accepting the constraints of rural life and the limitations that came from being Polish in an empire dominated by Russians who regarded Poles as inferior and troublesome. Klosowski chose education, pursued medical training, became what was called a Feldsher, a kind of assistant surgeon or barber-surgeon, whose training was practical rather than academic, who learned anatomy and basic surgery and pharmacology, who could perform minor operations and could treat common ailments, but who was not a fully qualified physician. The Feldsher training was rigorous despite being less prestigious than full medical education, required years of apprenticeship and study, provided knowledge of human anatomy that was detailed and practical, that was grounded in direct observation and in hands-on work with bodies living and dead. Klosowski learned how bodies were structured, where organs were located, how blood vessels ran through tissue, how to cut and suture and manipulate flesh, how to recognize disease and injury, how to administer medications and treatments. The training was meant to produce competent medical practitioners who could serve communities that lacked access to fully qualified doctors, who could provide basic healthcare to people who could not afford expensive physicians. But the same knowledge that enabled healing could enable harm. The same understanding of anatomy that allowed surgical treatment could guide violence. The same familiarity with medications and poisons that made treatment possible could make murder feasible. Klosowski acquired through his Feldsher training a foundation of knowledge that would prove versatile, that would serve him in legitimate barbering and in serial murder, that would connect him in the minds of some investigators to crimes that required anatomical expertise and to crimes that required pharmaceutical knowledge, to the sudden brutal violence of the Ripper, and to the slow patient poisoning that would eventually bring him to the gallows. In 1887, at age 21 or 22, Klosowski left Poland and travelled to London, joining the flood of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who were fleeing pogroms and poverty, who were seeking economic opportunity and religious freedom in England, who settled primarily in the East End where housing was cheap and where established Jewish communities could provide support and employment for newcomers. Klosowski was not Jewish himself, but he arrived in the same immigrant wave, settled in the same neighbourhoods, found work in the same trades that employed many of his fellow Poles. He found employment as a barber's assistant in a shop on West India Dock Road in Whitechapel, work that utilised his Feldsher training, that allowed him to perform the minor surgical procedures that barbers still provided in the 1880s: bloodletting, tooth extraction, treatment of minor wounds and abscesses. The barbershop was a male space where working-class men came for grooming and for medical care that was more affordable than seeing a proper doctor, where trust was built through repeated visits, where the barber became a familiar and respected figure in the community. Klosowski proved skilled at the work, was competent with razors and scissors, had the steady hands and the anatomical knowledge that made him effective at the surgical aspects of the trade. By 1888 he had established himself sufficiently to be working in his own small shop or as a senior assistant, had learned enough of English to communicate with customers, had adopted the name George Chapman either immediately upon arrival or during his first year in London, a transformation that was common among immigrants who anglicised their names to ease integration, to avoid the prejudice that came from having obviously foreign names, to present themselves as more English than they were. Severin Klosowski became George Chapman, the Polish Feldsher became the English barber. The transformation complete enough, that most people who knew him had no idea of his background or his origins. The timing and the location of Chapman's establishment in London would later seem significant to those who studied the Whitechapel murders. He arrived in 1887, 1 year before the Ripper killings began. He worked in Whitechapel itself, in the exact district where the murders would occur. He had anatomical knowledge that matched the surgical precision evident in the Ripper's work. He was a young single man living in circumstances that gave him freedom of movement and anonymity, that placed him in the streets of Whitechapel during the exact period when the murders were committed. None of this proved anything. Thousands of men fit similar descriptions, but the coincidences would accumulate and would eventually lead some investigators to consider whether George Chapman and Jack the Ripper might be the same person. The Whitechapel of 1887 and 1888 was perhaps the poorest and most desperate district in London, a place of overcrowded tenements and filthy streets, of casual prostitution and endemic alcoholism, of violence that was commonplace and deaths that were frequent enough that they rarely attracted notice unless they were particularly spectacular. The women who worked the streets selling sex for a few pence that would buy a night's lodging or a meal or more commonly a drink. These women were vulnerable in ways that made them ideal victims for someone who wanted to kill without being detected, who could approach them without arousing suspicion, who could lure them into dark corners or vacant lots where privacy could be obtained for the few minutes necessary to commit murder. Chapman lived and worked in this environment, knew its geography and its rhythms, understood where the prostitutes walked and where the police patrolled and where the shadows were deep enough to conceal violence. His barbershop gave him legitimate reason to be in the area, gave him regular hours that accounted for his presence, but that also left his evenings free, gave him access to sharp instruments and to anatomical knowledge, and to the kind of steady nerves that would be necessary to perform the mutilations that characterized the Ripper murders. Whether he was in fact the Ripper remained speculation, would never be proved, but the foundation for that speculation was being laid during these early years when Chapman was establishing himself in London, learning the city, building the life that would eventually include serial murder, even if those murders were accomplished through poison rather than through the blade. The character that Chapman presented to the world during these early years was one of quiet competence, of a skilled tradesman who worked hard and who caused no trouble, who was polite if somewhat reserved, who spoke with an accent but who was learning English rapidly, who seemed to be succeeding in the immigrant's perpetual struggle to establish himself in a new country. He dressed neatly, maintained good grooming that was expected of someone in his trade, kept his shop clean and his tools sharp, built a customer base that returned regularly and that recommended him to others. He appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a respectable barber pursuing honest work and honest income. But there were signs, visible in retrospect if not at the time, that suggested something else beneath the surface. The women who would later know Chapman intimately, who would live with him, and who would in 2 cases die by his hand, would describe him as controlling and jealous, as someone who presented a calm exterior but who could become violent when crossed, who had a temper that could flash suddenly and dangerously, who wanted absolute control over the women in his life, and who would not tolerate independence or resistance. These characteristics were not visible to casual acquaintances or to customers who saw only the professional persona, but they were there, were part of Chapman's fundamental nature, would become more apparent as his life progressed. The tools of Chapman's trade were significant in ways that would later seem ominous. The razors that he used daily on customers' faces and necks were essentially small surgical instruments, required to be extremely sharp, demanded steady hands and precise control, could open skin and sever blood vessels with minimal pressure. Chapman handled these tools expertly, maintained them carefully, understood their capabilities intimately. Whether he ever used similar instruments for purposes other than barbering, whether the anatomical knowledge he displayed in his legitimate work was also displayed in the mutilations of Whitechapel, remained questions that could not be answered definitively, but that would haunt discussions of his life and crimes. The year 1888 would prove pivotal for Whitechapel and for the history of crime, would mark the autumn when Jack the Ripper operated and when 5 women were murdered in ways that demonstrated both fury and precision, that combined frenzied stabbing with careful anatomical dissection, that suggested a killer who was simultaneously out of control and highly skilled, who could commit brutal violence and could also perform quasi-surgical procedures in darkness and under time pressure that would have challenged even trained surgeons working in proper conditions. The murders would terrorize London, would attract international attention, would spawn investigations that would continue for decades, would create a mystery that would never be definitively solved despite thousands of pages of speculation and hundreds of proposed suspects. George Chapman was in Whitechapel throughout the Ripper's active period, was working and living in the district, had the knowledge and the opportunity to have committed the murders if he had the inclination and the psychological makeup that would drive someone to such violence. Whether he was the Ripper, or was simply one of thousands of men who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills remained uncertain, would become one of many questions that would surround his life and his crimes, would connect him forever to mysteries that extended beyond the poisonings he would eventually be convicted of and executed for. The foreign barber had arrived in London, had established himself in Whitechapel, had built a life that appeared respectable and ordinary, had acquired skills and knowledge that could serve either healing or harm. The stage was set for crimes that would span 15 years, that would claim at least 3 lives and possibly 8, that would demonstrate patience and planning and a kind of cold calculation that was more disturbing in some ways than the sudden violence of street murders, because it required sustained intention, required living with victims while slowly killing them, required maintaining normal appearance while committing acts that were profoundly abnormal. But in 1887, as Chapman settled into his new life in London, these crimes lay ahead, were possibilities rather than actualities, were potential rather than realized. The man who had become one of Britain's most notorious poisoners was still just a young immigrant barber, apparently ordinary, apparently harmless, carrying within him whatever darkness would eventually express itself in murder, but not yet having acted on it, not yet having crossed the line from thought to deed, from capability to actuality, from being someone who could kill to being someone who had killed and who would kill again with a patience and a method that would define his crimes and that would distinguish him from the frenzied Ripper, even as some would argue they might be the same man, expressing different aspects of the same homicidal impulse. Chapter 2. Autumn of Terror. The transformation of Whitechapel from a place of ordinary poverty and suffering into a place of extraordinary terror occurred over approximately 10 weeks in the autumn of 1888, a period that began with the murder of Mary Ann Nichols on August 31st and that ended with the murder of Mary Jane Kelly on November the 9th, a span of time during which 5 women were killed in ways that demonstrated both savage violence and anatomical precision that created panic in London, and that generated investigations that would continue long after the murders themselves had stopped. The first canonical victim, as the 5 women would later be designated to distinguish them from other Whitechapel murders that occurred around the same time but that did not share the same characteristics, was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, a woman of 43 who had lived the hard life common to poor women in the East End, who had been married and had borne 5 children but who had descended into alcoholism and prostitution, who was found dead in the early morning hours of August 31st on Bucks Row. Her throat cut so deeply that she was nearly decapitated, her abdomen opened with cuts that extended from her sternum to her pelvis, her intestines exposed but not removed. The murder of Polly Nichols might have attracted only brief attention, might have been recorded as another unfortunate street killing in a district where violence was common, except that the mutilations were unusual, were more extensive than typical murders, suggested that the killer had spent time with the body after death, had performed cuts that seemed purposeful rather than random. The police investigation began routinely, questioned known criminals and suspicious characters, searched for witnesses who might have seen something, followed procedures that had solved other murders but that would prove inadequate for this case. 8 days later, on September 8th, the body of Annie Chapman was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, another middle-aged prostitute who had been killed in ways that were similar to the Nichols murder, but more elaborate, more deliberately mutilating. Chapman's throat had been cut, with the same deep precision, nearly severing the head, but the abdominal mutilations were more extensive. The uterus had been removed and taken away, other organs had been disturbed. The cuts showed knowledge of anatomy that suggested medical training, or at least familiarity with how bodies were constructed internally. The body had been arranged deliberately, the clothing had been pulled up and positioned, the intestines had been placed over the shoulder, creating a scene that was both horrific and organized. The murder of Annie Chapman created panic because the pattern was now visible, because 2 murders with similar characteristics suggested a serial killer rather than isolated incidents, because the mutilations implied purpose rather than simple violence. The newspapers began extensive coverage, gave the murder sensational treatment, created atmosphere of terror that was disproportionate to the actual danger, since the killer targeted only a specific type of victim, only prostitutes working in specific areas, but that felt overwhelming to residents of Whitechapel who understood that someone was hunting women in their streets and that the police seemed unable to stop him. The investigation intensified, with additional police deployed to Whitechapel, with plainclothes officers attempting to pose as customers of prostitutes in hopes of attracting the killer's attention, with rewards offered for information, with vigilance committees formed by local residents who organised patrols and who attempted to protect the women, who continued working the streets despite the danger because they had no alternative means of survival. But the increased police presence did not prevent the next murder, did not interrupt the killer's campaign, seemed to have no effect on someone who was either very skilled at avoiding detection or who was simply fortunate in his timing and in his selection of locations. The double murder of September 30th created new levels of terror and confusion. 2 women were killed within an hour of each other in different locations, suggesting either that the killer had been interrupted during the first murder and had immediately sought another victim, or that he was escalating his violence, was killing more frequently, was becoming more confident or more desperate. Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard with her throat cut, but without the abdominal mutilations that had characterized the previous murders, leading to speculation that the killer had been interrupted before he could complete his work. Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square less than an hour later, killed with the same throat cutting and with extensive abdominal mutilations including removal of the kidney and part of the uterus, with facial mutilations that had not appeared in the earlier murders, with evidence of cuts that demonstrated increasing confidence and increasing savagery. The double murder created chaos in the investigation, generated hundreds of new tips and theories, led to increased political pressure on police leadership to solve the crimes or to resign, created international attention that made the Whitechapel murders front-page news across Europe and America. The killer acquired a name during this period, was christened Jack the Ripper, by letters sent to newspapers and police that may or may not have been authentic, but that captured public imagination, and that gave identity to someone who remained unknown, who was a phantom, a shadow, someone who could be anyone, and who therefore seemed to be everywhere. The investigation during October produced numerous suspects but no arrests, generated theories about the killer's identity and motives but no definitive answers, created atmosphere of suspicion where everyone was potentially the Ripper, and where normal activities became suspicious. Doctors and medical students were investigated because the anatomical knowledge suggested medical training. Slaughtermen and butchers were investigated because they worked with knives and were familiar with cutting flesh. Immigrants were suspected because the East End had large immigrant populations and because foreigners were easy scapegoats for crimes that seemed foreign to English sensibilities. George Chapman was among the thousands of men who fit general descriptions of possible suspects, was a medical professional of sorts, was an immigrant, lived and worked in Whitechapel, had access to sharp instruments and had anatomical knowledge. But he was not particularly investigated during the Ripper inquiry, was not singled out as suspicious, was simply one of many men who were in the area and who had characteristics that might fit the limited profile that investigators had developed. He continued his barbering work throughout the Autumn of Terror, served customers who may have discussed the murders with him, who may have speculated about the Ripper's identity while Chapman shaved them, and said little, maintained the quiet professional demeanour that characterised his public persona. The final canonical murder occurred on November the 9th with the killing of Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the 5 victims at age 25, killed in her own room at 13 Miller's Court rather than in a street or yard, killed with a level of mutilation that exceeded all the previous murders combined. Her body so extensively dismembered and arranged that the scene suggested hours of work rather than the minutes that had sufficed for the earlier murders. Kelly's heart had been removed and was missing. Her face had been mutilated beyond recognition. Her organs had been arranged around the room. The murder scene was so horrific that even experienced police officers were sickened by what they found. The Kelly murder seemed to represent a climax or conclusion to the Ripper's campaign, was so extreme that some theorized the killer had satisfied whatever impulse drove him, or had reached a level of violence that could not be exceeded. After November 9th, the canonical Ripper murders stopped. No more killings occurred that matched the pattern. No more prostitutes were found with their throats cut and their bodies mutilated in ways that suggested anatomical knowledge and deliberate purpose. The terror gradually subsided. The intensive police presence was reduced. The vigilance committees disbanded. Life in Whitechapel returned to something resembling normalcy, though the murders were not forgotten, and the fear never entirely disappeared. The question of why the murders stopped has never been definitively answered, has generated theories ranging from the killer's death or imprisonment for unrelated crimes, to voluntary cessation, to relocation to another city or country. The timing of the cessation has been analysed extensively, with some arguing that the killer must have died or been incarcerated shortly after the Kelly murder, because serial killers typically do not stop voluntarily, because the escalation pattern suggested someone who was losing control rather than someone who could simply decide to quit. Others have argued that the killer might have left London, might have emigrated, or moved to another part of England, might have continued killing in locations where the murders were not connected to the Ripper, because the pattern was different, or because the investigation was less intensive. The anatomical knowledge displayed in the murders was one of the most discussed aspects of the case, was evidence that suggested professional medical training, or at least significant familiarity with human anatomy, that narrowed the suspect pool to men who had such knowledge, but that also raised questions about how much knowledge was actually required to perform the mutilations. Some doctors who examined the bodies concluded that the cuts showed definite surgical skill, that organs had been removed in ways that demonstrated understanding of where they were located and how to extract them efficiently. Others argued that the mutilations were crude rather than skilled, that anyone could have performed them given sufficient time and indifference to the victim's suffering, that anatomical knowledge was not necessarily required for what had been done. The connection between George Chapman and the Ripper murders rests primarily on several factors that would not become apparent until years later, until Chapman had been arrested and convicted for poisoning, and until investigators reviewing the Ripper case looked for suspects who had been in Whitechapel during the murders and who had anatomical knowledge and who had demonstrated capacity for violence. Chapman fit this profile, had been in Whitechapel during the relevant period, had Feldsher training that provided anatomical knowledge, would eventually prove himself capable of murder, even if his method was different from the Ripper's. But the connection also faces significant objections, most notably that Chapman's proven murders were accomplished through poison administered slowly over time, were domestic killings of women he lived with, were characterized by patience and planning rather than by sudden violence, were completely different in method and in psychological profile from the frenzied street murders of the Ripper. Serial killers typically have consistent methods, have patterns that remain relatively stable across their crimes, do not switch from explosive violence to patient poisoning or vice versa. The argument that Chapman might have been the Ripper requires accepting that he was capable of both types of killing, that he could commit the savage mutilations of 1888 and then could transition to slow poisoning a decade later, that he possessed psychological flexibility that would be unusual in serial killers. The Autumn of Terror ended with the Kelly murder, with Whitechapel gradually returning to its normal state of poverty and desperation, with the Ripper investigation continuing but producing no arrests and no solutions, with the murders becoming historical events rather than immediate threats. George Chapman continued his work as a barber, continued his life in the East End, gave no outward sign that he was connected to the murders or that he was anything other than what he appeared to be, a quiet immigrant tradesman making his way in London. Whether he was the Ripper, or whether he was simply a man who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills remained a question that could not be answered with certainty, that would be debated for more than a century after the murders, that would connect Chapman's name forever to the most famous unsolved crimes in history, even though he would eventually hang for completely different murders, murders that he definitely committed, murders that were proved beyond doubt through exhumations and chemical analysis, and overwhelming evidence that he had poisoned 3 women to death and had very nearly succeeded in poisoning a 4th. Chapter 3. The First Mrs. Chapman. The transition from bachelor barber to married man occurred for George Chapman in October 1889, approximately 10 months after the final canonical Ripper murder, a timing that some would later find significant, though it proved nothing beyond coincidence. Chapman married Lucy Bederski, a Polish immigrant woman who worked as a domestic servant, who was perhaps 23 years old, who spoke little English, and who was vulnerable in the way that young immigrant women were vulnerable in London, dependent on employment that was precarious, and on a community that could provide some protection, but that could also exploit those who lacked family or resources. The marriage was legal and was registered properly, was conducted at the Polish church that served the immigrant community in Whitechapel, was witnessed by people from that community who knew both Chapman and Lucy, and who had no reason to suspect that the marriage would be anything other than ordinary. Chapman was approximately 23 or 24, was established enough in his barbering work to support a wife, appeared to be a reasonable match for Lucy, who probably saw marriage as improvement over domestic service, as a path to stability and to the possibility of building a family and a life that would be better than what she could achieve alone. The marriage was troubled from the beginning, though the details of what occurred between Chapman and Lucy come primarily from her later testimony and from the accounts of people who knew them, and must be understood as one-sided narratives that may or may not accurately reflect the full complexity of their relationship. Lucy would later describe Chapman as violently jealous, as someone who accused her of infidelity without cause, who would become enraged if she spoke to other men, or if she failed to account for her time in ways that satisfied him, who wanted absolute control over her movements and her associations, and who would become physically violent when she resisted, or when he suspected her of disloyalty. The violence Lucy's described was not the explosive uncontrolled violence that might come from drunkenness or from sudden passion, but was calculated and deliberate, was violence used as tool for control and intimidation, was administered in ways that would not be visible to outsiders or that could be explained as accidents or as the result of Lucy's own clumsiness. Chapman would grab her by the throat, would squeeze until she could not breathe, would release her just before she lost consciousness, would leave her terrified and gasping but without marks that would be obvious to anyone who saw her. He would threaten to kill her if she left him, or if she told anyone about the violence, would describe in detail how he could poison her or cut her throat while she slept, would use his anatomical knowledge to make the threat specific and credible. The sexual aspect of the marriage was also troubled according to Lucy's later accounts, though Victorian reticence and the limitations of court testimony mean that details are sparse and are filtered through legal language that obscures as much as it reveals. Lucy suggested that Chapman had unusual demands or practices, that he wanted things that she found disturbing or painful, that the sexual relationship was characterized by coercion rather than by mutual consent or pleasure. The exact nature of what occurred is not documented clearly enough to describe with precision, but the suggestion is that Chapman's sexuality was connected to his need for control and dominance, that he used sex as another means of asserting power over Lucy, that the marriage bed was another site of abuse rather than of intimacy. The couple had 2 children during their marriage, a son born in 1890 and a daughter born in 1892, though some sources suggest there may have been a 3rd child who died in infancy. The presence of children complicated Lucy's situation in ways that were typical for abused women in the Victorian era, made leaving more difficult because she would have to support the children alone, because Chapman could claim parental rights and could use the children to control her, because society would judge her harshly for breaking up a family, even if the cause was his violence. Lucy stayed longer than she might have stayed otherwise, endured more than she might have endured, tried to make the marriage work despite the abuse because the alternatives seemed worse. Chapman's business ventures during the early years of his marriage showed ambition and showed willingness to take risks that sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed. He moved beyond simple barbering, attempted to establish himself in the pub trade, took over management of a barber shop on Cable Street that also served as a kind of lodging house, invested money he had saved or borrowed into ventures that would provide better income than barbering alone could generate. The businesses were moderately successful, generated enough income to support the family, allowed Chapman to present himself as an up-and-coming businessman rather than as a simple barber, gave him status in the immigrant community and connections that would prove useful in his later ventures. But the business success did not translate to domestic happiness, did not reduce the violence or the control that characterized Chapman's treatment of Lucy, may actually have increased his sense of power and his willingness to abuse because he was becoming more established and more confident. Lucy's situation deteriorated as the marriage continued, as the violence escalated, or perhaps simply as her willingness to endure it diminished, as she began to understand that Chapman was not going to change, and that staying meant accepting permanent subordination and permanent danger. The crisis point came in 1893 or 1894, the exact date is unclear from surviving records, when Lucy could no longer tolerate the marriage and took the extraordinary step of leaving Chapman, taking the children and moving out, establishing herself separately in accommodation that was probably provided by friends or by charitable organizations that assisted women fleeing domestic violence. The act of leaving was brave and was dangerous, required Lucy to give up whatever financial security the marriage provided, required her to face social disapproval and practical hardship, exposed her to retaliation from Chapman, who had threatened to kill her if she left. Chapman's response to Lucy's departure was anger and was pursuit, was attempts to force her to return, was threats and intimidation that continued for some time after the separation. But he did not kill her, did not follow through on the threats he had made, either because he was restrained by fear of consequences or because his violence required the domestic context to express itself, required the privacy and the sustained access that living together provided, could not manifest in the kind of public attack that killing Lucy after she had left would have required. Lucy survived the separation, established herself independently, raised the children, maintained the separation permanently despite Chapman's attempts to reconcile or to force her return. But Chapman never divorced Lucy, never legally ended the marriage, maintained his married status even as he began relationships with other women, began the patterns of serial bigamy that would characterize the rest of his life and that would provide him with the victims for the murders he would eventually commit. The failure to divorce was partly practical. Divorce was expensive and difficult in Victorian England, required proving adultery or cruelty in ways that were complicated and that exposed private matters to public scrutiny, was something that many people simply did not pursue, even when marriages had irretrievably broken down. But the failure to divorce was also strategic for Chapman, allowed him to present himself as single to women he would later partner with, allowed him to go through marriage ceremonies that had no legal validity, but that convinced the women that they were truly married, that gave him the control and the legitimacy he wanted, without the legal complications that actual marriage would create. The pattern was established through Chapman's relationship with Lucy, the pattern of violence and control, the pattern of presenting one face to the world and another face to the women who lived with him, the pattern of threats and intimidation and the willingness to use his knowledge of anatomy and of poisons to make those threats credible and specific. Lucy had escaped, had survived, had gotten away from Chapman before the violence escalated to murder. The women who had come after her would not be so fortunate, would enter relationships with Chapman without knowing his history, would believe his presentations of himself as a respectable businessman seeking a partner, would discover too late that the quiet man they had married or had moved in with was someone capable of sustained violence, was someone who would kill them slowly and carefully while maintaining the appearance of devoted husband, nursing his sick wife. Lucy lived for many years after leaving Chapman, raised the children, remarried eventually, built a love that was free from the violence and control that had characterized her first marriage. she would later testify at Chapman's trial, would provide evidence about his character and his capacity for violence, would help establish the pattern of behavior that made his guilt in the poisoning murders more credible, would finally be able to speak publicly about what she had endured and about the man Chapman truly was beneath the surface respectability. Her survival was remarkable given how many women died at the hands of violent husbands in Victorian England, was testament to her courage and to her willingness to sacrifice security for safety, to her understanding that staying meant accepting a future that would only grow worse. George Chapman moved forward from the failed marriage without apparent remorse or self-reflection, began looking for the next worldly woman who would trust him, began the cycle that would eventually claim 3 lives, began the transformation from abusive husband to serial killer, crossed whatever internal boundaries separated violence from murder, escalated from threats to actions, from someone who could kill to someone who would kill and who would do it with patience and planning that demonstrated that the violence Lucia had experienced was not loss of control but was deliberate choice, was expression of something fundamental in Chapman's character, was preview of the murders that would eventually bring him to trial and to the gallows. Chapter 4. The Publican's Trade. The transition from barbering to the public house trade marked a significant shift in George Chapman's life and business, represented upward mobility in economic terms, but also created the conditions that would enable his murders, that would give him the privacy and the domestic arrangements and the access to poisons that his crimes would require. The pub trade in late Victorian England was respectable enough if managed properly, provided steady income from the sale of beer and spirits, offered living quarters above or adjacent to the premises, created a kind of family business where a publican and his wife would work together, serving customers and managing the establishment. Chapman's entry into the pub trade began in the mid-1890s, shortly after his separation from Lucy, when he took over management of a public house called the Prince of Wales on Bartholomew Square in the City of London. The pub was a working-class establishment that served labourers and tradesmen, that provided beer and simple food, that was located in an area where such establishments were common and where competition was intense. Chapman brought to the work the same competence he had brought to barbering, maintained the premises adequately, served customers efficiently, built a regular clientele that appreciated the quiet foreign publican who poured good measures and who did not water the beer or engage in the various frauds that some publicans practiced. But running a pub required more than one person could manage effectively, required someone to serve behind the bar when Chapman was occupied with other tasks, required someone to maintain the living quarters and to prepare food if food was served, required a partner who could share the work and who could provide the domestic arrangements that would make the pub a home as well as a business. Chapman had separated from his legal wife and could not convince her to return, needed to find another woman who would fill that role, who would work alongside him, who would accept the ambiguous status of being his wife in practice if not in law. He found such a woman in Mary Isabella Spink, who was working as a barmaid when Chapman met her in 1895 or early 1896. Mary was approximately 30 years old, had been married previously but was now separated or widowed, had a young son from that previous relationship, was supporting herself through bar work that was respectable enough for working-class women, but that was also precarious and low-paid. She was attracted to Chapman's proposal that she come work with him in his pub, that she become his partner in both business and domestic life, that she take on the role of publican's wife even though Chapman could not legally marry her because he was still married to Lucy. Chapman presented himself to Mary as a widower or as a divorced man. The exact lie is not recorded, but the effect was to convince Mary that their relationship could be legitimate, that a marriage ceremony could be performed and would be valid, that she would be Mrs. Chapman in law as well as in practice. They went through some form of marriage ceremony in 1895 or 1896, a ceremony that had no legal validity because Chapman's marriage to Lucy had never been dissolved, but that convinced Mary that she was truly married, that gave her the security and the respectability that marriage provided, that made her willing to commit fully to the partnership with Chapman. The couple worked together at the Prince of Wales for approximately a year, developed a routine where Mary handled much of the customer service while Chapman managed the business side and the maintenance, presented themselves as married couple running a family business, lived in the quarters above the pub in arrangements that were indistinguishable from legitimate marriage. Mary's son from her previous relationship lived with them, was incorporated into the family, was treated adequately if not affectionately by Chapman, who tolerated the child as part of the arrangement that gave him access to Mary and to her labour. In 1897, Chapman moved the business to a new location, took over a pub called the Grapes on the Bishop's Gate Without, another working-class establishment in a different part of the city, a move that was probably motivated by business considerations or by the availability of better premises or more favourable lease terms. Mary moved with him, continued working alongside him, maintained the domestic and business partnership that had been established at the Prince of Wales. The move demonstrated that Chapman was succeeding in the pub trade, was able to transition between establishments, was building a career that provided better income and better prospects than barbering had offered. But sometime during 1897 or early 1898, Mary Spink began to experience health problems that would eventually kill her, would subject her to months of suffering, would demonstrate Chapman's method and his patience, and his willingness to watch someone die slowly while maintaining the appearance of devoted husband caring for his sick wife. The symptoms Mary experienced were consistent with chronic antimony poisoning, though neither Mary nor the doctors who treated her recognized them as such at the time, attributed them instead to various digestive ailments, or to consumption or to other diseases that were common in Victorian London and that produced similar symptoms. Mary complained of persistent nausea and vomiting, of stomach pains that would come in waves, of weakness and fatigue that made it increasingly difficult for her to work behind the bar or to maintain the household. She lost weight despite eating, lost strength despite resting, grew progressively more ill despite medical treatment that included various tonics and medications that the doctors prescribed for what they diagnosed as digestive troubles or as general constitutional weakness. Chapman was attentive and concerned, called doctors when Mary's condition worsened, administered the medications that were prescribed, provided nursing care that appeared devoted and appropriate, gave no outward sign that he might be the cause of Mary's illness rather than her caretaker. The source of the antimony that was poisoning Mary was almost certainly Chapman himself, was probably administered in small doses mixed into food or drink or into the medications that doctors had prescribed, was given regularly enough to maintain chronic toxicity, but not in quantities large enough to cause acute poisoning that would be immediately obvious and immediately fatal. Antimony was available to Chapman through various channels, could be purchased as tartar emetic from chemists who sold it as a medication for various conditions, could be obtained as antimony-based compounds that were used in veterinary medicine or in various industrial processes, was not controlled or restricted in ways that would make obtaining it difficult or that would create records of purchase that could later be traced. Chapman's knowledge of poisons and of their effects came partly from his Feldsher training, which would have included instruction in pharmacology and in the treatment of poisoning, came partly perhaps from self-education and from reading medical texts, came partly from experimentation and from observation of how Mary responded to different doses and different administration methods. The use of antimony specifically rather than other poisons that were available suggests deliberate choice based on knowledge of its effects, based on understanding that antimony poisoning produced symptoms that could be mistaken for natural disease, that it could kill slowly enough to avoid immediate suspicion, that it accumulated in the body in ways that would make detection difficult unless specifically looked for. Mary's suffering lasted for months, for the better part of a year, during which she grew progressively weaker and sicker, during which she was increasingly confined to bed, during which she lost the ability to work or to care for herself and became entirely dependent on Chapman's care. The doctors who attended her were baffled by the persistence of her symptoms, despite treatment, by the progressive deterioration that continued regardless of what medications were tried, by the eventual development of more severe symptoms, including severe abdominal pain and bloody vomit, and convulsions that suggested the disease had progressed beyond the point where recovery was possible. Chapman maintained his role as devoted husband throughout Mary's illness, continued operating the pub with hired help when Mary could no longer work, stayed with her during the worst episodes, called doctors when crises occurred, presented himself to the medical professionals and to acquaintances as a man doing everything possible to save his wife from a mysterious illness that was defeating all attempts at treatment. The performance was convincing because it was based partly in truth. Chapman did care for Mary in the sense of providing physical nursing, did call doctors and did administer medications, did everything that a devoted husband would do, except for the crucial fact that he was also the person who was causing the illness he appeared to be fighting. Mary Spink died on December the 25th, Christmas Day 1897, after approximately 10 months of progressive illness, after suffering that had become unbearable toward the end, after the failure of all the medical treatment, and after the exhaustion of all hope that she might recover. The death was attributed by the attending physician to phthisis, which was the Victorian term for consumption or tuberculosis, a diagnosis that was plausible given Mary's symptoms of wasting and weakness and respiratory distress, a diagnosis that was common enough that it raised no suspicion, a diagnosis that allowed Mary to be buried without autopsy or inquest, without any investigation into whether the death might have been caused by something other than natural disease. Chapman played the role of grieving widower, arranged for Mary's burial, paid for a modest funeral, appeared appropriately sad at the loss of his wife, accepted condolences from friends and customers who had known Mary and who had watched her decline, gave no indication that he had caused her death or that he was already thinking about finding her replacement. Mary was buried at Leytonstone Cemetery, was laid to rest in a grave that would not be disturbed for 5 years, that would eventually be opened and would yield its terrible secret when chemical analysis revealed massive quantities of antimony in tissues that had been preserved by the very poison that had killed her. The pattern was established through Mary Spink's murder, though no one recognized it as murder at the time, though Mary was mourned as a victim of disease rather than as a victim of her husband, though Chapman had successfully killed and had escaped any suspicion or investigation. The method was proved effective. The patience required was demonstrated to be within Chapman's capabilities. The rewards in terms of eliminating a partner who had perhaps become burdensome or who stood in the way of Chapman's plans for the future were achieved without cost or consequence. The success of the first murder made the second more likely, made the third almost inevitable, established a pattern that would repeat because it worked, because Chapman had learned that he could kill slowly and carefully, and that the Victorian medical establishment would not detect what he was doing, would attribute deaths to natural causes, would provide him with cover while he murdered. But Mary's death also created practical problems for Chapman, left him without a partner to help run the pub, left him alone in quarters that were designed for a couple, left him needing to find another woman who would fill the role that Mary had filled, who would work alongside him, and who would accept the quasi-marital arrangement that Chapman offered, instead of legal marriage. The search for Mary's replacement began almost immediately after her death, began while Chapman was still ostensibly mourning, began because Chapman needed a partner for business reasons, and perhaps for other reasons that were less practical and more psychological, that related to whatever drove him to form these relationships, and then to destroy them, to find women who would trust him completely, and then to kill them slowly while maintaining the appearance of devoted partnership. The pub trade had given Chapman the circumstances he needed to commit murder, had given him privacy and domestic access, and the kind of relationship where a wife's illness would be his responsibility, rather than being supervised by family or by others who might notice inconsistencies or suspicious circumstances. The trade had also given him access to poisons through the various chemicals and compounds that were used in cleaning and maintaining pub premises, had given him knowledge through experience of how to disguise tastes and how to administer substances in food and drink, had created conditions that were ideal for the kind of patient methodical murder that characterized Chapman's crimes. Mary Spink had been the first victim of this method, had died without anyone recognizing that she had been murdered, had been buried with sympathy rather than with suspicion, had left Chapman free to find his next victim and to repeat the pattern that would eventually claim 2 more lives before it was finally detected and stopped. Chapter 5. Bessie Taylor's Fatal Year. The period between Mary Spink's death in December 1897 and Chapman's acquisition of his next victim was brief, was measured in weeks rather than months, demonstrated either that Chapman had been planning Mary's replacement even before she died, or that he moved with remarkable speed to fill the void her death had created. By early 1898, only months after burying Mary, Chapman had entered into relationship with Bessie Taylor, had convinced her to come work with him at the pub, had begun the process that would lead to her death less than 2 years later in circumstances that would mirror Mary's death so closely that the pattern should have been obvious, but that would be attributed once again to natural disease because no one was looking for poison, no one suspected murder. Bessie Taylor was born Elizabeth Taylor, was approximately 30 years old when she met Chapman, had worked in various domestic service positions, had perhaps worked as a barmaid, though the exact details of her employment history are not completely documented. She was working class and respectable, had no family connections that would provide her with support or protection, was in circumstances where Chapman's offer of partnership in running a pub would have seemed like opportunity for advancement, for security, for building a life that would be better than what she could achieve through continued wage labour in service positions that offered no future beyond endless work for minimal pay. Chapman presented himself to Bessie as he had presented himself to Mary as a widower whose wife had recently died, as a successful publican who needed a partner to help run his establishment, as a man who was offering not just employment but a relationship that could lead to marriage once an appropriate mourning period had passed. Whether Chapman and Bessie went through any kind of marriage ceremony is not entirely clear from surviving records, but they certainly lived as husband and wife, presented themselves to the world as married, operated the pub as a partnership where Bessie took on all the duties that a publican's wife would normally perform. The couple moved to a new pub in 1899, took over the Monument Tavern on Union Street in Southwark, another working-class establishment that served beer and spirits to local residents and workers, that provided living quarters above the bar, that was similar in character to the previous establishments Chapman had operated. Bessie worked alongside Chapman at the Monument, served customers, maintained the household, performed all the labour that the business required, proved herself to be capable and hard-working, earned the respect of regular customers who appreciated her friendly demeanour and her competent service. The relationship between Chapman and Bessie during the first year was apparently stable and functional, showed no outward signs of the violence that had characterised Chapman's marriage to Lucy, demonstrated that Chapman could maintain relationships for extended periods when it served his purposes, that the violence was instrumental rather than compulsive, was deployed when it was useful rather than being constant expression of his character. Bessie had no reason to suspect that Chapman had killed his previous wife, had no warning that she was living with a murderer, had no way of knowing that the quiet, attentive man who worked beside her and who shared her bed was someone who would eventually kill her through the same slow, patient method he had used on Mary. The pattern of Bessie's illness began in late 1899 or early 1900, approximately a year after she had begun living with Chapman, a timing that was similar to Mary's illness, which had also begun about a year after she had moved in with Chapman. The similarity of timing might suggest that Chapman needed time to establish control and to create the domestic circumstances that would enable murder, needed the relationship to be stable and accepted before he began the poisoning, needed Bessie to be dependent and committed before he started the process that would kill her. Bessie's symptoms were identical to Mary's symptoms because they were caused by the same poison administered in the same way, were the characteristic signs of chronic antimony poisoning that Victorian doctors did not recognise as poisoning because they were taught to see such symptoms as indicators of various digestive diseases or of consumption or of other common ailments that produce similar effects. Bessie complained of nausea and vomiting, of stomach pains that came in waves, of weakness and fatigue that made work increasingly difficult, of progressive deterioration despite rest and despite whatever treatments the doctors prescribed. Chapman's response to Bessie's illness followed the same pattern he had established with Mary, was attentive and concerned, involved calling doctors and administering medications and providing nursing care, maintained the appearance of devoted husband trying desperately to save his wife from mysterious illness. The doctors who attended Bessie were apparently different doctors from those who had treated Mary, were seeing Bessie without knowledge of the previous case, had no reason to suspect that the illness might be caused by poisoning rather than by disease, had no basis for comparison that might have revealed the pattern. The suffering that Bessie endured lasted for approximately 14 months, was somewhat longer than Mary's illness had lasted, but followed the same general progression, the same steady deterioration, the same failure of all medical treatments, the same eventual development of severe symptoms that indicated the disease had reached terminal stage. Bessie was increasingly confined to bed during the later months of her illness, was unable to work, was completely dependent on Chapman's care, was isolated in the quarters above the pub where Chapman could control who saw her and what information reached the outside world. The isolation that characterized the final months of Bessie's life was important to Chapman's ability to continue the poisoning without detection, ensured that no one except Chapman had sustained access to Bessie, that no one could observe the administration of poison, or could notice patterns in when symptoms worsened, or could question whether the medications Chapman was giving her were actually helping or were making things worse. Bessie's dependence on Chapman for all care and all nursing meant that Chapman controlled what she ate and drank, controlled what medication she received, controlled the information that reached doctors about her symptoms and about the progression of her illness. The doctors who attended Bessie during her final illness were frustrated by their inability to help her, by the persistence of symptoms despite treatment, by the progressive deterioration that continued regardless of what they tried. They consulted with each other, changed diagnoses and treatments as symptoms evolved, eventually concluded that Bessie was suffering from some form of consumption or perhaps from cancer of the digestive system, diseases that were common and that were often fatal in the Victorian era, diseases that produced symptoms similar to what Bessie was experiencing, diseases that would explain why she was dying despite their best efforts. Bessie Taylor died on February 14th, Valentine's Day 1901, after 14 months of progressive illness, after suffering that had been intense toward the end, after exhaustion of all medical options and abandonment of all hope for recovery. The death was attributed by the attending physician to exhaustion from vomiting and diarrhea, to the effects of what was probably cancer or consumption, to natural disease that had proved resistant to treatment. The attribution of death to natural causes allowed Bessie to be buried without autopsy, without inquest, without any investigation that might have revealed poison, without any suspicion that Chapman had killed her. Chapman arranged Bessie's funeral, buried her at Tooting Cemetery, mourned her death publicly, accepted condolences from friends and customers, gave no indication of guilt or of satisfaction at having successfully committed his second murder. The burial of Bessie in a different cemetery from Mary's burial meant that the two deaths were geographically separated, that any pattern that might emerge from having two wives die of similar illnesses and be buried in the same location was avoided, that Chapman was perhaps being careful about creating connections that might eventually attract attention. The success of Bessie's murder reinforced the lessons Chapman had learned from Mary's murder, confirmed that the method worked, that antimony poisoning could be sustained for months without detection, that Victorian doctors would attribute the symptoms to natural disease, that the role of devoted husband nursing dying wife provided perfect cover for murder, that patient killers could operate successfully in domestic contexts where their crimes would be interpreted as tragedies rather than as murders. Chapman had now killed twice using the same method, had perfected the technique, had demonstrated to himself that he could do this successfully, that the rewards of eliminating wives who had perhaps become burdensome or who stood in the way of new relationships were worth the effort and the risk. But the pattern was now established more clearly for anyone who might look. The pattern of women who moved in with Chapman and who sickened after approximately a year, and who died after prolonged illness that doctors could not successfully treat. Two deaths might still be coincidence, might still be explained as simple bad luck, but 3 deaths would strain coincidence beyond credibility, would create pattern that even without direct evidence of poison would suggest that something more than disease was claiming Chapman's wives. The third murder would prove to be Chapman's undoing, would finally attract the suspicion that had been absent in the first 2 cases, would lead to investigation and exhumation and chemical analysis that would reveal what had been done, that would prove Chapman was a murderer, that would send him to trial and to the gallows. But in February 1901, as Bessie was buried and mourned, as Chapman began the process of finding her replacement, these consequences lay ahead in the future. For the moment, Chapman was successful, had killed twice without being caught, had eliminated 2 women without suffering any consequences, had proved to himself that he could murder with impunity as long as he was patient and careful, as long as he maintained the appearance of respectability and concern, as long as he chose victims who were isolated and dependent and whose deaths would be attributed to disease rather than to poison. The fatal year that had claimed Bessie Taylor's life had also claimed any possibility that Chapman might stop killing, had established murder as part of his life pattern, had demonstrated that whatever moral constraints might have prevented the first murder were now completely overcome, that Chapman would continue killing as long as he could find victims, and as long as the method continued to work, and as long as no one recognized what he was doing and stopped him. The third victim would soon enter Chapman's life, would trust him as Mary and Bessie had trusted him, would sicken as they had sickened, but would survive in ways that Mary and Bessie had not survived, would be the victim whose case would finally expose Chapman's crimes and would bring justice for all 3 women who had died and for the one who had very nearly joined them. Chapter 6. Maud Marsh and the Suspicious Doctor. The replacement for Bessie Taylor came more quickly than the replacement for Mary Spink had come, demonstrated either that Chapman was becoming less cautious about appearances, or that his need for a new partner was more urgent, that he could not or would not wait through extended mourning period before beginning his next relationship. Within months of Bessie's death, Chapman had entered into arrangement with Maud Marsh, had convinced her to come live with him and work with him at his pub, had begun the cycle that would lead to her near death and to his eventual exposure and execution. Maud Marsh was barely 18 years old when she met Chapman in mid-1901, was young enough to be his daughter, given that Chapman was now approximately 35 or 36, was vulnerable in ways that made her ideal victim for someone who sought control and who sought someone who would be completely dependent and who would not question authority. Maud came from a working-class family, had limited education and limited employment prospects, was employed as a barmaid when she encountered Chapman, who presented himself as a successful publican seeking a young wife to help him run his establishment and to provide him with domestic partnership. The age difference between Chapman and Maud was significant and would have been noticed by Maud's family and by others who knew them, but such differences were not uncommon in Victorian England, where older men with resources often married much younger women, where marriage was often economic arrangement as much as romantic partnership, where young women understood that marrying well meant marrying someone established who could provide security. Chapman presented himself to Maud and to her family as widower, whose wife had died recently from illness, as man who owned successful pub business, as someone who could provide Maud with better life than she could achieve through continued work as a barmaid earning minimal wages. Maud's parents initially objected to the relationship, were concerned about the age difference and about Chapman's foreign accent, and about the speed with which the relationship was progressing from initial meeting to plans for cohabitation and marriage. But Chapman was persistent and persuasive, convinced Maud that he was devoted to her, convinced her parents that he could provide well for their daughter, eventually overcame the objections and obtained permission to take Maud as his partner. Whether an actual marriage ceremony was performed is unclear from surviving records, but Chapman and Maud lived as a married couple, presented themselves as such, and Maud believed herself to be Mrs. Chapman in law as well as in practice. The couple moved to yet another pub, took over the Crown on Borough High Street in Southwark, returned to the area where Chapman had operated earlier, established themselves in premises that were similar to the Monument and to the earlier establishments, settled into the routine of pub operation, with Maud learning the work and Chapman maintaining his role as manager and primary operator. Maud worked hard, proved capable despite her youth and inexperience, earned the affection of regular customers who appreciated her cheerful demeanour, seemed to be thriving in her new role as publican's wife. The pattern of Maud's illness began in late 1901, approximately 6 months after she had moved in with Chapman, a timing that was somewhat shorter than the year or so that had preceded the illnesses of Mary and Bessie, but that followed the same basic pattern of establishing relationship before beginning the poisoning. Maud's symptoms were identical to those experienced by Mary and Bessie because they were caused by the same poison administered in the same way, were the characteristic effects of chronic antimony poisoning that included nausea and vomiting and stomach pain and progressive weakness. But Maud's case would prove different from the earlier cases in a crucial way because the doctor who attended her, a physician named Francis Stoker, was more observant and more suspicious than the doctors who had treated Mary and Bessie, was willing to question whether the symptoms might be caused by something other than natural disease, was ultimately responsible for recognizing that Maud was being poisoned and for taking actions that would save her life and that would expose Chapman's crimes. De Stoker began attending Maud in October 1901 when she first became ill, diagnosed initially what he thought was some digestive complaint, prescribed standard treatments that should have provided relief if the cause was ordinary illness. But Maud's condition did not improve with treatment, continued to worsen despite the medication Stoker prescribed, showed pattern of deterioration that persisted regardless of what approaches were tried. Stoker grew concerned and frustrated, wondered why his treatments were not working, began to suspect that perhaps the diagnosis was wrong or that perhaps something else was affecting Maud's condition. The patterns of Maud's symptoms troubled Stoker because they would sometimes improve when Maud was away from the pub or when Chapman was absent, would worsen when she returned, or when Chapman was present to provide care. The variation was not dramatic enough to be immediately obvious, but was sufficient to plant suspicion in Stoker's mind, to make him wonder whether there might be some environmental factor in the pub that was affecting Maud's health, whether something she was eating or drinking might be causing the illness. Stoker's suspicions intensified in early 1902 when Maud's condition deteriorated dramatically, when she began experiencing more severe symptoms including bloody vomit, and intense abdominal pain and convulsions that suggested poisoning rather than disease. Stoker consulted with other physicians, discussed the case with colleagues, began to research conditions that might produce the symptoms Maud was experiencing, eventually arrived at the possibility that she might be suffering from antimony poisoning, that someone might be administering poison rather than her illness being natural. The decision to test for poison was delicate and was potentially dangerous because it meant accusing Chapman implicitly of attempting to murder his wife, meant creating conflict that could become violent, meant exposing Stoker to legal liability if the accusation proved wrong. But Stoker believed that Maud's life was in danger, that she would die if the poisoning continued, that his obligation as physician was to protect his patient even if that meant confronting her husband and making accusations that might prove difficult to support if poison was not found. Stoker obtained samples of Maud's vomit and sent them for chemical analysis, requested specifically that they be tested for antimony and for other common poisons, waited anxiously for results that would either confirm his suspicions or prove them wrong. The analysis came back positive for antimony, revealed that Maud had significant quantities of the poison in her system, confirmed that she was being poisoned rather than suffering from natural disease, provided the evidence Stoker needed to take action to protect Maud and to notify authorities. The confrontation between Stoker and Chapman occurred in October 1902 when the poison test results were confirmed, when Stoker informed Chapman that Maud was being poisoned and that the authorities would be notified, when Chapman's entire world began to collapse as the pattern he had successfully maintained through 2 murders was finally exposed. Chapman denied any knowledge of poison, claimed that he was devoted to Maud and would never harm her, suggested that perhaps the poison had been administered accidentally through contaminated food or medicine, or through some other innocent means. But Stoker was not convinced by Chapman's denials, arranged for Maud to be removed from Chapman's care and taken to Guy's Hospital, where she could be treated for poisoning and where she would be safe from further harm, notified police that he suspected Chapman of attempting to murder his wife, provided them with the evidence from the poison analysis and with his observations about the pattern of Maud's illness. Maud was hospitalized in critical condition, was treated with emetics and with supportive care designed to eliminate the poison from her system and to manage the damage it had caused, fought for her life in hospital bed, while police began investigating whether Chapman had indeed poisoned her and whether he might have poisoned others. Maud survived the poisoning, recovered slowly under hospital care, that prevented Chapman from having any further access to her, was eventually well enough to provide testimony about her illness and about Chapman's behaviour during the period when she was sick. Her survival was crucial to the investigation because it meant there was a living victim who could testify, who could describe the symptoms and the progression of illness, who could provide information about what she had eaten and drunk and who had prepared it, who could help investigators understand how the poisoning had been accomplished. The police investigation expanded rapidly once Maud's poisoning was confirmed, focused initially on determining whether Chapman had a history of similar cases, whether other women in his life had died under suspicious circumstances, whether the pattern of illness that Maud had experienced matched illnesses that others had suffered. The investigators learned about Bessie Taylor's death, learned that she had died after prolonged illness that sounded similar to Maud's symptoms, learned that she had been buried at Tooting Cemetery. They learned about Mary Spink's death, learned that she too had died after prolonged illness, learned that she had been buried at Leytonstone Cemetery. The decision to exhume the bodies of Mary Spink and Bessie Taylor was made based on the similarity of their illnesses to Maud's illness, based on the suspicion that if Chapman had poisoned Maud, he might have poisoned previous wives, based on the understanding that antimony was a preservative that might have kept the bodies in condition where poison could still be detected years after burial. The exhumations were approved by magistrates, were carried out in October 1902, approximately 5 years after Mary's death and approximately 18 months after Bessie's death. The exhumations revealed bodies that were remarkably well preserved because the antimony that had killed them had also prevented normal decomposition, had kept tissues intact in ways that allowed for chemical analysis that would have been impossible if the bodies had decomposed normally. The analysis of tissues from both bodies revealed massive quantities of antimony, revealed levels of the poison that were far beyond what could be explained by accidental exposure or by therapeutic use, revealed conclusively that both women had been poisoned deliberately and systematically over extended periods, that they had died not from disease but from murder. The evidence from the exhumations combined with the evidence from Maud's poisoning provided overwhelming proof that Chapman was a serial killer, that he had murdered at least 2 women and had very nearly succeeded in murdering a third, that his patient-careful method had allowed him to operate successfully for years before being detected. Chapman was arrested and was charged with the willful murder of Maud Marsh, the charge being attempted murder since Maud had survived, and with the murders of Mary Spink and Bessie Taylor based on the poison found in their exhumed bodies. Maud's survival had saved her own life, and had also brought justice for Mary and Bessie, had exposed Chapman's crimes, had ended his career as a serial poisoner, had ensured that he would face trial for his murders and would answer for what he had done to 3 women who had trusted him, and who had paid for that trust with their lives or with near death. The suspicious doctor had succeeded where the previous doctors had failed, had recognized poison where others had seen only disease, had acted on his suspicions despite the risks, had saved one life and had brought justice for 2 others, had demonstrated that even patient-careful killers could be caught if physicians remained vigilant and willing to question diagnoses that did not make sense, and willing to consider murder when the evidence suggested it. Chapter 7. The Exhumations. The legal process that allowed for the exhumation of Mary Spink and Bessie Taylor required careful navigation of Victorian law and custom, required convincing magistrates that sufficient cause existed to disturb the dead, required overcoming the strong cultural resistance to grave opening that was rooted in religious belief about the sanctity of burial and in practical concerns about public health and about the dignity owed to the deceased even after death. But the evidence from Maud Marsh's poisoning provided compelling justification, demonstrated that Chapman had administered antimony to at least one woman with intent to kill, created reasonable suspicion that previous wives who had died after similar illnesses might also have been poisoned. The application for exhumation orders was made by police investigators working with prosecutors who would eventually try Chapman for murder, was supported by affidavits from Dr. Stoker describing Maud's poisoning, and from other witnesses who could testify to the similarities between Maud's illness and the illnesses that had killed Mary and Bessie. The magistrates who reviewed the applications understood the gravity of what was being requested, understood that exhumation was a serious step that should not be undertaken lightly, but also understood that if Chapman had indeed murdered 2 women and buried them as victims of natural disease, then justice required that those murders be proved and prosecuted. The exhumation of Mary Isabella Spink was conducted on October the 22nd, 1902, at Leytonstone Cemetery, almost 5 years after her burial on December the 28th, 1897. The grave was opened under police supervision with medical personnel present to examine the body and to collect samples for chemical analysis, with proper documentation of the entire process to ensure that evidence would be admissible in court, with attention to the dignity of the deceased even as her body was disturbed for purposes of criminal investigation. The coffin was lifted from the grave and was opened, revealing Mary's body in state of preservation that surprised and disturbed those present, because antimony had prevented normal decomposition, had kept tissues relatively intact, had created conditions where chemical analysis could be performed with confidence that results would be meaningful. The body showed the effects of 5 years in the ground but was not reduced to skeleton, as would normally be expected, retained enough soft tissue that organs could be identified and sampled, demonstrated through its preserved state the very poison that had killed Mary because antimony was a preservative as well as a poison, prevented bacterial action that would normally decompose bodies, created the ironic situation where the murder weapon was also the evidence preservation method. The medical examiner who conducted the post-mortem examination collected samples of liver, kidney, stomach contents, and other tissues that would be subjected to chemical analysis, documented the condition of the body, noted signs of antimony poisoning that were visible even without chemical testing, created record that would be crucial to the prosecution's case. The exhumation of Bessie Taylor was conducted on October 24, 1902 at Tooting Cemetery, approximately 20 months after her burial on February 14, 1901. The process was identical to Mary's exhumation, was conducted with the same care and documentation, revealed body that was similarly preserved by antimony, that retained sufficient tissue for chemical analysis, that provided the evidence needed to prove that Bessie had been poisoned in the same manner and with the same substance that had been used to poison Mary and to poison Maud. The preservation of Bessie's body was even more remarkable than Mary's preservation, because the time since burial was shorter, because decomposition had barely begun, because the antimony had so thoroughly saturated tissues that bacteria could not establish themselves to begin the normal process of decay. The chemical analysis of tissues from both bodies was performed by Dr. Thomas Stevenson, an expert in toxicology, who served as lecturer on forensic medicine at Guy's Hospital, who had testified in numerous poisoning cases, who had the expertise and the credibility to provide evidence that would convince a jury that antimony had been present in quantities that proved deliberate administration rather than accidental exposure. Stevenson used standard analytical techniques of the period, employed methods that had been refined over decades of forensic work, applied tests that could detect and quantify antimony even in tissues that had been buried for years. The results of Stevenson's analysis were unambiguous and were damning. Mary Spink's body contained approximately 7.24 grains of antimony, an enormous quantity that was far beyond what could be explained by any legitimate medical use or by environmental exposure, that proved beyond reasonable doubt that she had been poisoned deliberately and systematically. Bessie Taylor's body contained approximately 29.12 grains of antimony, an even more staggering quantity that indicated prolonged administration of the poison over many months, that demonstrated the patience and the systematic nature of Chapman's method. The antimony was distributed throughout the bodies, was found in multiple organs, was present in concentrations that could only have resulted from repeated doses administered over extended periods. The quantities of antimony found in the exhumed bodies were particularly significant because they represented only what remained after years of being in the ground, only what had not been lost through leaching or through whatever minimal decomposition had occurred despite the preservative effects of the poison. The actual quantities that Mary and Bessie had ingested during their illnesses had been higher, possibly much higher, had been sufficient to kill them slowly through cumulative toxic effects, while producing symptoms that doctors had attributed to natural disease. The analysis results provided scientific proof of murder, provided evidence that would be nearly impossible for Chapman's defense to challenge, provided the foundation for prosecution that would seek to prove Chapman guilty of serial murder. The exhumations and the subsequent analysis also provided vindication for Mary and Bessie themselves, proved that they had been murdered rather than having died from disease, proved that their suffering had been inflicted deliberately by someone they had trusted, proved that they deserved justice that had been denied them at the time of their deaths when they were buried as victims of natural causes. The exhumations transformed Mary and Bessie from unfortunate women who had died young from illness into murder victims whose deaths demanded prosecution and punishment, whose cases would be heard in court, whose stories would be told publicly in ways that honored their memory and that sought to bring their killer to account. The publicity surrounding the exhumations was intense and was sensational, with newspapers covering the story extensively, describing the preserved bodies and the poison analysis and the emerging picture of Chapman as a serial killer who had murdered at least 2 women and who had very nearly murdered a third. The coverage created public fascination with the case, generated demand for details about how the poisoning had been accomplished, created atmosphere where Chapman was already convicted in public opinion before his trial began. The newspapers characterized Chapman as a monster, as a man who had systematically murdered women who loved him, as a poisoner whose patience and calculation made his crimes more disturbing than spontaneous violence would have been. The evidence from the exhumations also created practical problems for the prosecution because they had to decide which murder to charge Chapman with first, had to determine whether to try him for all 3 cases simultaneously or to try them separately, had to consider strategic questions about which case presented the strongest evidence and which would be most likely to result in conviction. The decision was made to charge Chapman primarily with the murder of Maud Marsh, technically attempted murder since Maud had survived, because her case was most recent and because she could testify as a living witness, could describe her symptoms and Chapman's behavior, could provide evidence that would make the poisoning real and personal to a jury in ways that evidence about exhumed bodies might not. But the prosecution also planned to introduce evidence about Mary and Bessie's deaths to establish pattern, to prove that Chapman had killed before using the same method, to demonstrate that Maud's poisoning was not an isolated incident but was part of systematic behavior, was expression of Chapman's fundamental character rather than being aberration or accident. The legal framework for introducing evidence of previous crimes in cases where the defendant had not been charged with those crimes was complex and would require careful argument, but the prosecution believed that the similarity of the cases was so striking that a judge would allow the evidence to be presented, would recognize that pattern evidence was crucial to proving Chapman's guilt. The exhumations had provided the physical evidence that would convict Chapman, had proved scientifically what investigators had suspected, had transformed speculation about possible murders into demonstrated facts about actual murders. The bodies that had been buried in the belief that disease had claimed them had yielded their terrible secrets, had spoken from beyond the grave through the poison that remained in their tissues, had provided testimony that would be more convincing than any living witness could provide because it was scientific and objective, was based on chemical analysis rather than on memory or interpretation, was evidence that could not be impeached or discredited through cross-examination. Mary and Bessie had been dead for years but were now witnesses against their killer, were providing through their preserved remains the evidence that would send Chapman to the gallows, were achieving in death the justice that had been denied them in life when they were buried without investigation, without suspicion, without anyone recognizing that they had been murdered. The exhumations had given them voice, had allowed their suffering to be acknowledged, had ensured that their deaths would not be forgotten or dismissed as simply unfortunate losses, but would be recognized as crimes that demanded punishment. The process of exhumation and analysis had taken weeks, had required coordination between police and medical experts and cemetery officials and prosecutors, had generated mountains of documentation and evidence that would need to be organized and presented at trial. But by late October and early November of 1902, the work was complete. The evidence was assembled. The case against Chapman was ready to proceed to trial. George Chapman, the quiet foreign publican who had seemed so respectable and so ordinary, was revealed to be a serial killer whose patience and whose medical knowledge had allowed him to murder successfully for years before being detected, whose crimes had claimed at least 2 lives and had very nearly claimed a third, whose trial would expose the dark reality beneath the surface of Victorian domesticity and would raise questions about how many other similar cases might exist undetected. How many other women might have died at the hands of husbands or partners whose crimes were attributed to disease rather than to murder. Chapter 8. The Trial and the Ripper. The trial of George Chapman for the willful murder of Maud Marsh began at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, on March 16, 1903, before Mr. Justice Grantham, with Sir Edward Carson leading the prosecution and Mr. George Eliot conducting the defence. The proceedings attracted enormous public attention, filled the courtroom with spectators who had followed the case through newspaper coverage, generated daily reports that appeared in papers across Britain and that were reprinted in newspapers around the world. The case had everything that made for sensational coverage: poison, multiple victims, a foreign defendant, medical testimony, the exhumation of bodies, and ultimately the question of whether Chapman might be connected to even more famous murders, whether the man on trial for poisoning might also be Jack the Ripper. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive, built on the scientific evidence from the exhumations and from Maud's poisoning, supported by testimony from doctors and from witnesses who had known Chapman and his victim, designed to prove not just that Maud had been poisoned, but that Chapman had poisoned her and had poisoned Mary and Bessie before her. Sir Edward Carson opened by describing the pattern of Chapman's relationships, the way women came into his life and worked alongside him in his pubs, and then began to sicken after approximately a year, the way the illnesses progressed despite medical treatment, the way Chapman played the role of devoted husband while administering the poison that was killing his wives. The medical evidence was crucial to the prosecution's case, and was presented through testimony from Dr. Stoker, who had recognised Maud's poisoning, from De Stevenson, who had analysed the tissues from the exhumed bodies, from other physicians who had treated the victims and who could describe their symptoms and their progressive deterioration. Stoker testified about his growing suspicions regarding Maud's illness, described how the pattern of symptoms had led him to consider poisoning, explained his decision to test for antimony, and his actions upon confirming that poison was present. His testimony established that Maud had been deliberately poisoned, that the poisoning had been systematic and prolonged, that she would have died if the poison had not been detected, and if she had not been removed from Chapman's care. Stevenson's testimony provided the scientific foundation for the entire case, explained how antimony poisoning worked, described the symptoms it produced, detailed the analysis he had performed on tissues from Mary and Bessie's exhumed bodies and from samples collected during Maud's treatment. He testified that the quantities of antimony found in the bodies were far beyond what could be explained by any legitimate purpose, that the distribution of the poison throughout multiple organs proved that it had been administered repeatedly over extended periods, that the chemical evidence proved beyond doubt that all 3 women had been poisoned with the same substance administered in the same manner. The testimony from witnesses who had known Chapman and his victims provided human context for the scientific evidence, described the relationships and the domestic arrangements, detailed how Chapman had presented himself as devoted husband, recalled the progression of the illnesses and Chapman's apparent concern in his nursing care. Lucy Badursky, Chapman's legal wife from whom he had separated years earlier, testified about his violence and his jealousy, about his threats to kill her, about the fear she had felt living with him, providing evidence of Chapman's capacity for violence and for control that made the poisoning murders more credible. that established pattern of abusive behaviour that had escalated from threats to actual murder. The evidence about Mary Spink and Bessie Taylor was admitted despite objections from the defence, with Justice Grantham ruling that the similarity of the cases was so striking that evidence of previous murders was relevant to proving that Maud's poisoning was deliberate rather than accidental, was part of pattern rather than being isolated incident. The testimony about Mary and Bessie's deaths, about the symptoms they experienced and about the antimony found in their bodies, provided powerful corroboration for the prosecution's theory that Chapman was a serial killer who used the same method repeatedly, who killed women who trusted him and who lived with him, who administered poison slowly and carefully while maintaining appearance of respectability. The defence's case was weak and was largely perfunctory, attempted to suggest that the antimony might have been administered accidentally or might have come from some source other than Chapman, suggested that the deaths might have been from natural causes and that the poison found in the bodies might have accumulated after burial through contamination from soil or groundwater. But these arguments were not convincing given the quantities of poison involved, and given the consistency of the pattern across 3 cases, were contradicted by expert testimony about how antimony behaved in buried bodies and about how the distribution of the poison throughout organs proved deliberate administration rather than environmental contamination. Chapman himself did not testify, exercised his right to remain silent, sat through the trial without offering explanation or defense beyond what his attorneys presented on his behalf. His demeanor was calm and was controlled, showed no obvious emotion as the evidence was presented, gave no indication of guilt or of remorse, maintained the same quiet exterior that had characterized his public persona throughout his life. The newspapers remarked on his coldness, on his apparent indifference to the suffering he had caused, on the contrast between his controlled appearance and the horror of the crimes he was accused of committing. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning guilty verdict on March 19, 1903, found Chapman guilty of the willful murder of Maud Marsh, found that he had administered poison with intent to kill, found that the evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt that he was guilty of the crime charged. Justice Grantham pronounced sentence of death, ordered that Chapman be hanged by the neck until dead, set execution date for early April. Chapman received the sentence without visible reaction, was led from the dock to the condemned cell where he would spend his final weeks, maintained silence about his crimes and about his life that would persist until his execution. But outside the courtroom and in the newspapers and in public discussion of the case, speculation was already growing about whether Chapman might be connected to other murders beyond the 3 poisonings he had been convicted of or implicated in. The speculation focused particularly on the Jack the Ripper murders, on the possibility that Chapman might have been the Ripper, that the man who had poisoned 3 women in the 1890s and early 1900s might also have been the man who had butchered 5 women in Whitechapel in 1888. The theory gained credibility when Inspector Frederick Aberline, who had been one of the senior investigators in the original Ripper case, was quoted as saying that he believed Chapman and the Ripper might be the same person, that the evidence was compelling enough to warrant serious consideration. Aberline's statement carried weight because of his intimate knowledge of the Ripper case, because he had spent months investigating those murders and interviewing witnesses and developing theories about the killer's identity. His belief that Chapman might be the Ripper was based on several factors, including Chapman's presence in Whitechapel during the relevant period, his anatomical knowledge from his Feldsher training, his capacity for violence demonstrated through the poisoning murders, and perhaps most significantly the timing of the cessation of the Ripper murders, which had stopped in November 1888, shortly before Chapman married Lucy Bodersky in October 1889, suggesting that marriage might have temporarily satisfied whatever impulse drove the Ripper, or might have changed circumstances in ways that made the murders more difficult or more risky. The theory that Chapman was the Ripper faced immediate and sustained objections from other investigators and from criminologists who studied serial murder. The primary objection was that the methods were completely different, that the Ripper had killed through sudden explosive violence with knife, had committed murders that were frenzied, and that involved extensive mutilation performed quickly in public or semi-public locations, while Chapman had killed through patient administration of poison over months, had committed murders that were calm and controlled and that occurred in domestic privacy. The psychological profiles seemed incompatible, seemed to describe 2 completely different types of killers, seemed impossible to reconcile as being the same person. The defenders of the theory argued that the apparent incompatibility of methods might be explained by changing circumstances, that Chapman might have committed the Ripper murders while he was single and living alone, and working in Whitechapel where opportunities for street murders existed, might have transitioned to poisoning when he entered into domestic arrangements where that method was more feasible and more suited to his circumstances. They argued that both types of murder demonstrated anatomical knowledge, that both showed capacity for violence and for viewing women as objects to be used and destroyed, that the fundamental psychology might be consistent even if the expressions were different. The debate about Chapman's possible identity as the Ripper would continue for decades after his execution, would generate books and articles and documentaries that examined the evidence and that reached different conclusions, would never be resolved definitively because the evidence was circumstantial, and because Chapman had maintained silence about any crimes beyond those he was convicted of. Modern criminologists generally reject the theory, argue that serial killers do not switch methods so dramatically, that the psychological differences between sudden violent murder and patient poisoning are too fundamental to be bridged by circumstantial changes, that the coincidences of timing and location and anatomical knowledge are insufficient to overcome the incompatibility of the methods. But the theory persists because it cannot be definitively disproved, because Chapman was in Whitechapel during the Ripper murders and had the knowledge and potentially the opportunity to commit them, because the cessation of the Ripper murders and Chapman's marriage occurred in temporal proximity that might be meaningful or might be coincidental, because the possibility that such a famous unsolved case might be connected to a solved case is inherently attractive to those who study crime and who seek patterns and connections. Chapman remains one of dozens of proposed Ripper suspects, is neither the strongest candidate nor the weakest, occupies a middle position where the theory is plausible enough to be discussed, but not compelling enough to be widely accepted. The trial had proved Chapman guilty of poisoning murders, had demonstrated that he was a serial killer who had murdered at least 2 women and who had attempted to murder a third, had resulted in death sentence that would be carried out within weeks. But the trial had also raised questions that would outlive Chapman, questions about his possible connection to the most famous unsolved murders in history, questions about whether the quiet foreign publican who poisoned his wives might also have been the frenzied killer who terrorized Whitechapel 15 years earlier, questions that would never be answered with certainty, but that would ensure that George Chapman's name would be remembered, not just for the crimes he was convicted of, but for the crimes he might possibly have committed. Chapter 9. The Scaffold and the Mystery. The final weeks of George Chapman's life were spent in the condemned cell at Wandsworth Prison, in circumstances that were designed to prevent suicide, and to ensure that the prisoner survived to face execution, that the sentence pronounced by Justice Grantham would be carried out as ordered by the court. Chapman was watched constantly by warders who worked in shifts to maintain surveillance, was provided with adequate food and with such comforts as were permitted to condemned prisoners, was allowed visits from prison chaplain and from his legal representatives, though he apparently received no visits from family or from anyone who had known him in his life outside prison. Chapman's behaviour during his final weeks was characterised by the same calm and controlled demeanour that had marked his conduct throughout the trial, showed no obvious signs of fear or remorse, gave no indication that he intended to confess or to provide information about his crimes beyond what had been proved at trial. The chaplain who attended him reported that Chapman participated in religious services, but showed no particular spiritual awakening, made no admissions of guilt, maintained the silence about his inner life that he had maintained throughout his adult years. The warders who guarded him found him to be quiet and cooperative, noticed nothing remarkable about his behaviour, described him as someone who seemed resigned to his fate rather than as someone who was struggling against it, or who was consumed by guilt or by fear. The question of whether Chapman would confess before his execution was of intense interest to police and to the press, was the subject of speculation about whether he might finally provide information about the Ripper murders if he was indeed the Ripper, whether he might admit to additional poisoning victims beyond Mary and Bessie and Maud, whether he might explain his motives or provide insight into the psychology that had driven him to commit serial murder. But Chapman gave no indication that confession was forthcoming, maintained the same silence in the condemned cell that he had maintained in the dock, apparently intended to take whatever secrets he possessed to the grave rather than sharing them with those who sought to understand what he had done and why. The execution was scheduled for April 7th, 1903 to be carried out by James Billington, who was one of Britain's official executioners, who had hanged numerous prisoners and who was experienced in the technical aspects of the work, who could be relied upon to perform the execution efficiently and with minimal suffering for the condemned man. The execution would be conducted according to standard procedures that had been refined over decades, would involve measuring and weighing the prisoner to calculate the appropriate drop length that would break the neck cleanly and cause instantaneous death rather than slow strangulation, would be witnessed by required officials and by press representatives who would report on the execution to satisfy public interest. The morning of April 7th arrived with Chapman apparently composed and calm, showed no resistance when the time came, walked to the scaffold with steady gait and with assistance from warders who supported his arms, was positioned on the trapdoor with efficiency that came from Billington's experience. The hood was placed over Chapman's head, the noose was positioned around his neck, the final moments passed with the speed that characterized professional executions, the lever was pulled and the trapdoor opened and Chapman fell through and died, the whole process from entering the execution chamber to death taking perhaps less than 30 seconds. The official witnesses confirmed that death appeared to have been instantaneous, that Chapman had not struggled or shown signs of suffering, that the execution had been carried out properly according to regulations and according to the sentence that had been pronounced. The body was left hanging for the required hour to ensure that death was complete, was then taken down and was examined by a prison doctor who certified that death had occurred, was prepared for burial in the prison grounds as was standard practice for executed prisoners. Chapman was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison walls, was interred without ceremony, disappeared into the anonymity that claimed most executed criminals whose bodies were not returned to families and whose graves were not marked or maintained. The execution of George Chapman brought legal closure to the poisoning cases, represented the justice system's final action against a man who had been proved to have murdered at least 2 women and to have attempted to murder a third, demonstrated that patient methodical killers could be caught and could be punished even when their crimes had initially been attributed to natural causes. But the execution did not bring closure to the questions about Chapman's possible identity as Jack the Ripper, did not resolve the debate about whether the man who had died on the scaffold was also the man who had terrorized Whitechapel 15 years earlier, left those questions unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable given Chapman's refusal to confess or to provide any information beyond what had been proved at trial. The mystery of Chapman's possible connection to the Ripper murders would persist long after his execution, would be examined and re-examined by generations of researchers who studied both cases, who looked for connections and for evidence that might prove or disprove the theory that Chapman and the Ripper were the same person. The evidence that supported the connection included Chapman's presence in Whitechapel during the relevant period, his anatomical knowledge from Feldsher training, his demonstrated capacity for violence through the poisoning murders, the timing of the cessation of Ripper murders shortly before Chapman's marriage, which might have changed his circumstances in ways that made street murders less feasible or less attractive. But the evidence against the connection was also substantial, and was perhaps more compelling to most researchers who studied the cases. The methods were fundamentally different in ways that seemed impossible to reconcile, with the Ripper representing explosive, violent fury expressed through frenzied knife attacks and mutilations performed in minutes in public or semi-public locations, while Chapman represented patient-controlled violence expressed through slow poisoning administered over months in domestic privacy. The psychological profiles seemed incompatible, described killers with completely different relationships to violence and to their victims, suggested different motivations and different satisfactions derived from the acts of murder. The question of whether one person could commit both types of murder, could be both the Ripper and the poisoner, required accepting that Chapman possessed extraordinary psychological flexibility, that he could switch between completely different methods and completely different modes of violence depending on circumstances, that the fundamental drive to kill could express itself in radically different ways at different times. Some researchers argued this was possible, that serial killers were adaptable, and that method was less important than the act of killing itself. That Chapman might have used whatever method was most available and most suited to his circumstances at any given time. Others argued it was implausible, that serial killers typically had consistent methods that reflected deep psychological needs, that switching from knife to poison represented change too fundamental to be explained by mere circumstantial adaptation. The debate was complicated by the fact that Chapman's motives for the poisoning murders were never clearly established, were subject to interpretation and speculation. The prosecution had suggested that Chapman poisoned his wives when they became inconvenient or when he wanted to move on to new relationships, that the murders were instrumental rather than being driven by psychological compulsion to kill. but others suggested that Chapman might have derived satisfaction from the act of poisoning itself, from the control it gave him over his victims' suffering and death from watching them deteriorate slowly while maintaining the facade of devoted husband, from the power that came from being the only person who knew that their illness was manufactured rather than natural. If Chapman's poisoning murders were driven by psychological needs rather than by mere convenience, if he derived satisfaction from the process of slow killing and from the power dynamics involved, then the connection to the Ripper became even more difficult to sustain, because the Ripper's satisfaction appeared to come from different sources, from the explosive violence and from the mutilation and from the public nature of the crimes that terrorized an entire district. The two types of murder seemed to serve different psychological purposes, seemed to satisfy different needs, seemed to be expressions of different personalities rather than different methods employed by the same personality. The mystery of George Chapman extended beyond the question of whether he was the Ripper, extended to questions about his fundamental nature and about what had driven him to become a serial killer. Was he a psychopath who lacked empathy and who killed for practical reasons when victims became inconvenient? Was he a sadist who derived pleasure from inflicting suffering and from exercising power over helpless victims? Was he someone who killed to assert control in circumstances where he felt powerless in other aspects of his life? The answers to these questions died with Chapman, were locked in the silence he maintained about his inner life, were unavailable to those who sought to understand what had made him a killer. The legacy of George Chapman in the history of crime was significant despite his relative obscurity compared to more famous killers, represented important case study in domestic poisoning, and in the difficulty of detecting slow systematic murder that was disguised as natural illness. The case demonstrated that medical knowledge could be used for murder as well as for healing, that anatomical expertise could guide violence as well as surgery, that patient killers could operate successfully for years before being detected if they chose methods that produced symptoms resembling natural disease. The case also demonstrated the importance of medical vigilance, showed that observant physicians who were willing to question diagnoses and to consider poisoning could save lives and could expose murders that would otherwise remain undetected. Chapman's execution marked the end of his life, but not the end of speculation about his crimes, not the end of questions about whether he had killed more than the 3 women he was connected to, whether there were other victims whose deaths had been attributed to disease when they had actually been murdered, whether Chapman's career as a poisoner had begun earlier than the death of Mary Spink in 1897. The questions would remain unanswered, because Chapman had chosen once, had refused to satisfy curiosity or to provide closure, had taken to his grave whatever knowledge he possessed about his crimes and about his motives and about whether he was connected to other unsolved murders, including the most famous unsolved murders in British history. The scaffold had claimed George Chapman on April 7, 1903, had ended his life in the same methodical, professional manner that characterized all British executions of the period, had provided the justice that the law demanded for his proved crimes. But the mystery that surrounded Chapman would persist, would ensure that his name would be remembered not just for what was proved at trial, but for what remained uncertain, for the possibility that the quiet foreign publican who poisoned his wives might also have been the monster of Whitechapel, for the questions that would never be answered with certainty, but that would continue to fascinate those who studied crime and who sought to understand the darkness that could exist beneath the surface of ordinary lives. The Bedside Historian closes this account of George Chapman with recognition that some mysteries cannot be solved, that some questions will remain unanswered, despite all investigation and speculation, that the dead sometimes take their secrets with them into graves that yield no further revelations. Chapman was proved to be a poisoner and a serial killer, was justly executed for murders that were demonstrated beyond doubt, but whether he was also Jack the Ripper, whether he killed 5 women in Whitechapel in 1888, as well as 3 women through poison in the 1890s and early 1900s, remains a question that can be debated, but cannot be definitively answered more than a century after his death. May you rest more peacefully than the women who trusted George Chapman and who paid for that trust with their lives. Until we meet again in the darkness where history preserves its mysteries, where the past yields some answers but guards others jealously, where the truth about the Ripper and about Chapman's possible connection to those crimes remains hidden in shadows that no amount of investigation has been able to fully illuminate. The candle burns low, the final page is turned, and somewhere in an unmarked grave within the walls of Wandsworth Prison, The remains of George Chapman rest in the same silence he maintained in life, carrying to eternity whatever secrets he possessed about the murders he committed and about the murders he may have committed, about the women who died by his hand and about the monster of Whitechapel, who may or may not have been the same man who died on the scaffold in April 1903.